The candle had burned down to a thumb's width when the old man's hand closed around her wrist. His fingers were cold, the skin loose over the bones, and yet the grip held a strength she had not believed remained in him. Across the great bed the fire had sunk to embers, and the long blue room of Brookhaven had gone so quiet that she could hear the rain finding the gaps in the leads above the window. He pulled her down toward the pillow, and his lips moved, and the words came out of him in a thread no thicker than smoke. "Burn the letters," he told her. "Burn them all, and tell no one they were ever written." Prudence did not answer. She could not. The bundle he meant lay not 3 feet from her hand, tied in faded green ribbon at the bottom of the rosewood box he had asked her to fetch from beneath the bed an hour before, when the doctor had at last gone down to his supper and left the two of them alone with the dying. She had untied that ribbon while the Earl slept. She had read every page by the light of the same dwindling candle. And so, when he begged her to put them in the fire, she already knew exactly what it was he wished the world never to see, and she knew, with a calm that frightened her, that she would not be able to obey him. What no one in that house yet understood, on the wet night the Earl of Brookhaven began to die, was that the letters he wanted burned named the very people who had been allowed to starve at his gate. She held his hand until the grip slackened, and he sank back into the half-sleep that had taken more and more of his hours. The doctor came up again at midnight, and a footman, and the housekeeper with her ring of keys, and Prudence stood back against the paneling where a good servant stood, with the box pushed beneath a chair, and her heart going so hard she was certain they must hear it. They did not look at her. To the household of Brookhaven she was a useful pair of hands and nothing more, and that, for once, was a mercy. Her name, before the great house had swallowed it, had been Prudence Vale. She was 24 years of age, and she had come into service 3 winters past, when the small annuity that had kept her after her father's death failed, along with the bank that held it. She remembered the morning the news came, the agent standing in the parlor of the only home she had known turning his hat in his hands, explaining in soft, regretful sentences that the funds were gone, that there had been nothing dishonest in it, only the ordinary ruin that fell on careful people who had trusted careful men. She had been 23 then, and she had thanked him, because there was no one else to thank, and she had sat that night at her father's desk, and added up in his own ledger, in his own neat columns, exactly how little stood between herself and the road. The answer had been 1/4's rent, and a string of seed pearls that had been her mother's. She had sold the pearls and kept the ledger, and within the month she had taken the post at Brookhaven, because a gentlewoman fallen out of her station has, in that age, a single narrow door open to her, and it leads downstairs. Her father had been a country attorney in a market town 2 days' ride to the north, a careful and honest man who had taught his only daughter to read a deed and to keep an account and to distrust any sentence that hid its meaning behind too many words. He used to set her to copy his correspondence of an evening when other girls were set to their samplers, and he would lean over her shoulder and tap the page where a phrase had been made deliberately vague, and tell her that a man who would not say plainly what he meant was a man preparing to do something he did not wish to be held to. She had not understood it then as anything but a lesson in penmanship. She understood it now, with 11 unanswered letters against her ribs, as the whole of what he had given her. She had thought, when she took the post of companion maid to the old Earl, that she was burying all of that learning in a sick room. She had been wrong. The Earl had wanted more than broth or laudanum or company, someone who could read to him, and so for 3 years she had read to him, and in the reading he had come to trust her with the small movements of his failing mind. He had not trusted her with the letters. Those he had kept locked away, and she had not known they existed until the night he sent her under the bed for the box. The first of them had been written in a woman's hand, the ink browned with age, the paper soft as cloth from folding and refolding, as though it had been read many times by the one who kept it before it was ever sent. It was dated 19 years before, and it was addressed to the Earl from a village called Ferncross, which lay, Prudence knew, at the very edge of the Brookhaven lands, 3 miles down the river road, where the water meadows flooded every spring. The woman who wrote it begged the Earl, in plain and trembling words, to honor the promise he had made to her husband, The husband, it seemed, had been the Earl's steward, a man named Coram, who had served the estate for 30 years and had drowned saving 2 of the Earl's tenants from the spring flood, going back into the brown water a second time when he might have stood safe on the bank. The Earl had stood at the graveside in his black coat and sworn, before the whole parish and the open grave, that Coram's widow and her children would never want for bread or roof or coal while Brookhaven stood. The letter was the widow's reminder, and she had set it down with a care that broke the heart in the round, labored hand of a woman who did not write often and had saved her best ink for this. She wrote that the rents had been raised twice since the funeral, that the cottage roof had fallen in over the winter and let the snow onto the bed, that her eldest had gone for a soldier at 16 because there was no bread for so many mouths, and that she did not understand, she wrote, how a gentleman's word, sworn before God and the parish, could weigh so very little once the man who heard it was in the ground. Prudence had read that first letter twice through, there in the dying candlelight, and then she had gone on to the others, and the others were worse because the others were the same hope wearing thinner. The second letter, a year on, was shorter and stiffer, the voice of a woman learning not to expect an answer, but unable yet to stop asking. By the 5th, the widow no longer spoke of the promise at all, only of small particular needs, a winter's coal, a doctor for a fever, as though she had decided that a great man could not be moved by a great wrong, but might still be reached by a small mercy. By the 9th she had stopped asking for herself, and asked only that the youngest, a girl, might be taken into service somewhere, anywhere, that she might eat. There was no reply folded with any of them. There was no copy of any reply kept, as a careful man keeps copies. There were only the 11 letters, tied in their faded green ribbon, and shut in a rosewood box, and pushed under a bed, where 11 years of a son's exile and 3 years of a stranger's reading had passed over them, and never once disturbed them. There had been 11 such letters in the bundle, written across 19 years, and not one of them, so far as Prudence could tell by any mark or memorandum, had ever been answered. That was the thing she carried down the back stairs at 1 in the morning, the box beneath her shawl, while the rain went on against the dark windows of Brookhaven. She did not yet know what she would do with it. She only knew that a man could not be permitted to carry such a thing peacefully into the ground, and that the burning of it would make her, who had read it, the last keeper of a lie. The Earl of Brookhaven died 3 days later, on a gray afternoon, with the first hard frost silvering the park, and the house filled within the week with people who had not troubled to visit him, living. Foremost among them was Lady Sabine Crow, the widow of the late Earl's younger brother, who arrived in a traveling coach with her trunks and her own footman and the settled air of a woman coming home. She was perhaps 50, handsome still, with pale hair, dressed high, and a way of moving through a room as though the furniture had been arranged for her convenience. She had been mistress of a much smaller house all her married life, and she did not mean to be mistress of a small house any longer. Within an hour of her arrival she had the household assembled in the great hall, and she walked the line of them with her gloved hands folded, and when she came to Prudence, she paused. The companion, she said to the housekeeper, as though Prudence were a chair that had been left in an awkward place, "We shall not be wanting a companion now. There is no one to keep company. See that she has found other work, or found a character, and sent on. I will not have idle mouths." It was the first of the 3 times Prudence would hear herself named so, and it was said in a private aside low, not meant for her at all, which was somehow worse than if it had been flung in her face. She kept her eyes down, and her hands still, as a servant must, and she did not let the woman see that anything had landed beneath her bodice, sewn into the lining where the housekeeper's keys could not find it. The 11 letters lay flat against her ribs, and she was aware of them with every breath. Lady Sabine had come for one purpose, and she made no secret of it among her own. She had a son, a soft pink young man of 27, named Mr. Crombo, Hugh Crow, who followed his mother through the house, touching things, and she meant to see him installed as the next Earl of Brookhaven. The difficulty was that the title and the estate were not hers to give. They belonged, by the old Earl's own settlement, to a man no one at Brookhaven had seen in 11 years. That man arrived on the morning of the funeral, on a tired horse, with the mud of the road still on his boots. His name was Vincent, Viscount Aldermere, and he was the late Earl's only son. Prudence had heard him spoken of in the servants' hall, the way one speaks of a ghost or a scandal, in lowered voices that broke off when she came near. There had been a quarrel, years past, of a kind that fathers and sons fall into and then make monstrous by their pride. The son had gone abroad. The father had struck his name from his lips, though not, it turned out, from his will. And now the son had come back to bury the man who had cast him out, and to inherit everything that man had failed to do. He was perhaps 34 tall, with the weather of foreign places still on his skin, and a stillness about him that the household read as coldness. He stood at the graveside in a black coat that did not quite fit a man so lately come from hard living, and he did not weep, and Lady Sabine, watching him, allowed herself a small satisfied tightening at the corner of her mouth, because a man who does not weep at his father's grave is a man the world will be slow to love. Prudence stood at the back of the mourners among the servants, with the cold coming up through the soles of her worn shoes. She watched the new Earl's face through the whole of the service, and she saw what the others did not. She saw that his stillness was not the absence of feeling, but the holding of it. She saw his jaw set like carved stone when the clods went down, and she saw his hand at his side close slowly into a fist, and then with great deliberation open again. He had taught himself that, she thought. Somewhere in some hard place he had learned to put his grief away where it could not be used against him. She knew the trick. She had learned it herself. That evening he sent for the household, as Lady Sabine had done. But he did not walk the line of them. He stood by the cold hearth in the library, the great floor-to-ceiling shelves rising into shadow behind him, and he thanked them, each by name where he knew the name, for their service to his father. When he came to Prudence, the housekeeper murmured her place, the companion who read to the late Earl, and the new Earl of Brookhaven looked at her for the first time. "You read to him," he said. Pursed. His voice was low and level, and it asked nothing. "It did not mean every evening, my lord," she answered. Until he could no longer hear, something moved behind his eyes, quick and gone like a fish turning under dark water. He inclined his head and passed on. Prudence carried that look down to her cold attic room, and lay awake beneath the slope of the roof, the letters against her ribs, and understood that the man who had come home to Brookhaven had loved his father after all, and had been given no chance to say it, and would now spend the rest of his life with the words still in him. She, of all people, knew what that cost. And she knew, lying there, that the letter she carried would either be the cruelest thing she could put into such a man's hands, or the only thing that could set him free. She did not decide that night. She waited, as she had been taught to wait, and she watched the house arrange its loyalties. It did not take long for the household to divide. Lady Sabine had money to spread and promises, and the easy confidence of a woman who had always been obeyed. And a number of the upper servants began to find reasons to be useful to her. The new Earl had only his name and his silence, and the suspicion that clung to any man who had quarreled with his father and gone abroad to live, no one knew how. Lady Sabine encouraged that suspicion gently, the way one encourages a fire, never seeming to do more than warm her hands at it. At her dinners, to which the county families came because they were curious, she would speak of her late brother-in-law's broken heart, and let the name of the son hang unspoken in the candlelight, and her guests would draw the conclusion she had laid out for them, like a place setting. It reached Prudence's ears at last through Sarah, the under-housemaid who shared the cold attic landing, and who carried gossip the way other girls carried candles to light her way through a dull life. Sarah came up one night with her cap askew and her eyes bright with the importance of what she knew, and she sat on the edge of Prudence's narrow bed and reported, in the hushed, delighted way of the young, what Lady Sabine had said of the companion below stairs that very evening. The lady had told her own woman, who had told the cook who had told Sarah, that the late Earl's reading girl was not to be trusted near the new master, that a creature of that sort always had an eye to bettering herself above her station, and that it would be a charity to the house to see her gone before she made herself a nuisance. Sarah told it as a kindness, a warning between friends, and she could not understand why Prudence only thanked her quietly and turned her face to the wall. It was the third time, and it came to her not flung in her face, nor spoken across a bright table, but carried up 3 flights through 3 pairs of hands, worn smooth as a river stone. And somehow the wearing made it heavier, for she understood that the word had been set loose in the house, and was traveling now without Lady Sabine's help. The way such words do. Prudence saw the new Earl ride out alone each morning to the far edges of his land and come back gray with cold and say nothing. She saw him sit late in the library with the estate ledgers open before him, and she saw, carrying up his coffee one black morning because the footman had taken Lady Sabine's coin and overslept, that he was not reading the ledgers at all. He was holding one open and staring through it at nothing, and his thumb moved along the edge of the page over and over. And when she set the cup at his elbow, he did not start, but he said, without turning, that he supposed she thought him a poor master. "I think nothing, my lord," she said. "It is not my place to think that," he answered. "Is the first untruth you have told me." And for a moment, just a moment, the corner of his hard mouth shifted, not into a smile, but toward the memory of one. She should have gone then. A good servant does not stay in a room with her master longer than her errand requires. Yet she stood with the empty tray against her apron, and she heard herself say that the books were honest, whatever else the house said of the man who kept them, because she had carried the old Earl's accounts to and from his bed for 3 years, and she knew an honest column when she saw one. He turned in his chair and looked at her fully, and the look went on too long, and she felt it the way one feels the sun come out from behind a cloud onto cold skin. Then she remembered herself and curtsied, and took the tray away, and her hands were not quite steady on it. That was the beginning of the thing neither of them named. It grew the way frost grows on a window. In the dark, without sound, a little more each night. He found small reasons to keep her near the library. She found that the duties that brought her there had become the part of the day she could not do without. He did not touch her. He stood a careful, deliberate distance from her always, as though he did not trust the inches between them, and she understood that the distance was not coldness, but its opposite held under guard, and the understanding undid her more than any nearer thing could have done. She had told herself she would give him the letters when she was sure of him. She told herself that for a fortnight, and in the 2nd week of that fortnight, Lady Sabine moved. It was at a dinner, the largest the house had seen since the funeral, with the candles lit down the whole length of the long table, and the county come in its silk. Prudence had been pressed into service at the side of the room, as extra hands were, standing back against the wall in the borrowed black of a parlor maid, near enough to fill a glass and far enough to be furniture. She heard the conversation turn, as Lady Sabine steered it, to the question of the estate, and to the strange disappearance of the late Earl's charity, which all the county had once admired. There had been a famous promise, someone said, to a drowned man's family. Whatever had become of that? Lady Sabine set down her glass. It was a sad thing, she said, to see what a house becomes when it passes to a man who has spent his years abroad and learned foreign ways of valuing people. She did not look at her nephew when she said it. She looked at her plate, which was crueler, and her voice carried the length of the table without ever being raised. The Earl of Brookhaven set down his own glass with great care, and before he could speak, Prudence, against every rule that governed her life, against 3 years of learned stillness, heard her own voice come into the silence of that bright room. The promise was not broken by him, she said. Every face at the table turned. Lady Sabine's pale brows rose in a perfect arc of astonishment that a thing against the wall had spoken. The Earl went very still, and Prudence stood with the wine bottle in her 2 hands, and her father's training rising up in her like a tide, and she said that she had served the late Earl 3 years, and read him his correspondence, and that the famine of charity in this house had begun 19 years ago, and ended only with the old Earl's death, and that the man at the head of the table had been on the other side of the world for the most of it, and could not be blamed for a single year of it. The room was silent. Lady Sabine recovered first. She smiled, the way a blade smiles. "How extraordinary," she said softly, "that the help should be so well informed. And how unfortunate." She turned to the housekeeper at the door. "This girl is dismissed. She will be gone from this house by morning, without a character, and the county will know why, that servants who forget their station find no second place." It was the second time, and it was said in the full hearing of 30 people, in the bright public cruelty of the lit table. And this time, Prudence felt it land. She set the bottle down. She curtsied to the table, because even now her hands knew their work, and she walked the length of the long room toward the door with every eye upon her, and she did not let them see her tremble. She had read the letters. She had spoken the truth of them, and it had cost her, in the space of a single sentence, the roof over her head, and the only character that would let her find another. The Earl did not stop her. She had not expected him to. To stop her would have been to take a servant's part against his own blood at his own table, and no man in his uncertain place could afford it, and she told herself, climbing to the attic to pack her small box, that she did not blame him, and the telling was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she wept once, hard and short, with her fist against her mouth. And then she stopped because weeping changed nothing, and the morning came, whether one wept or not. She did not sleep. Toward 4 o'clock, with the candle out and the frost making its slow flowers on the glass, she took the 11 letters from the lining of her stays and held them in the dark and thought about the fire. She could burn them even now. She could do the dead man's bidding and carry his secret out of his house into the cold of her own ruin, and no one would ever know the house of Brookhaven had let a drowned hero's children starve at its gate. The old Earl had asked it of her with the last strength in his hand. It would be a kind of loyalty. It would also be a lie laid over 11 other lies. And she was the daughter of a man who had taught her that the worst thing a person could do with the truth was to keep it warm and quiet in the dark, where it could harm no one but the innocent. She did not burn them. When the household began to stir, she went down, not to the kitchen door in the road, but to the library. And she knocked, and when his voice told her to enter, she went in and shut the door behind her, and stood with her back against it. The Earl of Brookhaven was at the cold hearth, dressed though it was barely light, as though he too had not slept. He looked at her, the dismissed girl with her bonnet on and her box, no doubt already at the kitchen door, and something crossed his face that she could not read. "My lord," she said, "before I go, there is a thing your father asked me to burn, and I did not burn it, and I think it is yours and not the fire's." She crossed the room. She laid the 11 letters on the table between them, untied the faded green ribbon with fingers that had gone steady at last, and she stepped back. Then she told them what they were. She told them of Coram, the steward who had drowned, saving 2 tenants in the spring flood, and the promise his father had made at the graveside before the whole parish, and the widow's 11 letters across 19 years, and the rents raised and the roof fallen in and the boy gone for a soldier because there was no bread, and how not one letter had ever been answered, and how the old Earl, dying, had begged her to put the whole of it in the fire, and tell no one it had ever been written. The Earl did not touch the letters at first. He stood and looked at them on the table, as a man looks at a wound. Then he sat, slowly, and he took up the topmost letter, the widow's first, and he read it, and his face while he read it was the face she had seen at the graveside, the holding of a thing too large to be let out. When he had read 3 of them, he set them down and put his hand across his eyes, and was silent. For a long time she stood and let him be silent. She knew that silence, she had her own. He had thought, he said at last, his voice not quite his own, that the quarrel had been about him, about his marriage that his father forbade, about the woman he had loved and lost in the waiting, about all the small wars of a proud house. He had carried 11 years of it across the world. The certainty that his father had cast him out for disobedience and never once unbent. And here, in his hands, was the thing his father had truly been ashamed of, the thing he had hidden even from his own heir, the broken word that had eaten the old man hollow from the inside, while he let the world believe his grief was for a runaway son. His father had not been able to bear his own face, so he had made the son the villain of the house, because it was easier to be a wronged father than a forsworn lord. "I am sorry," Prudence said. It was the only true thing she had to give him. He looked up at her then, and the distance he had kept so carefully these weeks was gone out of his eyes. "You read these," he said. "You knew what they were. You could have burned them and gone, and I would have buried him a saint, and you would have had your character and your peace. Why did you not?" "Because she said my father was an honest attorney in a small town, and he taught me that the truth does not stop being the truth, because it is inconvenient to the powerful. And because, my lord, I did not think you wanted to spend your life believing a thing that was not so." He stood. He came around the table, and he stopped at the careful distance he always kept. And then, for the first time, he did not keep it. He took her hand, the same hand his father had gripped on the night of the letters, and he held it in both of his, and he did not say anything at all, and the not saying was the whole of what he meant. Then the door opened. Lady Sabine had not believed a servant could be dismissed without supervising the going. She stood in the doorway with the mourning behind her and her son at her shoulder, and she took in the room in a single sweep: the dismissed girl, the unburned letters, the Earl with the creature's hand in his, and her face. For one unguarded instant, showed Prudence the thing beneath the polish, the fear of a woman watching a door close on the only future she had allowed herself to want. Then the polish came back down over it. So she said, "The help has found a better use for itself." The Earl did not let go of Prudence's hand. He turned, and he was very calm, and the calm was more terrible than any anger. He asked his aunt whether she would do him the kindness of reading aloud. To himself and to the household she had been so busy gathering to her the letter that lay topmost on the table. Lady Sabine did not move. He asked again in the same level voice, and when she still did not move, he read it himself, standing in the cold library with the gray light strengthening at the windows. The widow's first letter, the drowned man, the broken word, the children at the gate. He read it through to the end. Then he set it down and told his aunt that the charity his father had promised would be restored that very week, with 19 years of arrears, out of the estate she had hoped to settle on her son, and that the widow of Ferncross and her surviving children would be the first call upon Brookhaven before any dinner was given or any silk was bought. Lady Sabine's hand rose to the back of a chair and held it. The thing she had built, the patient architecture of suspicion and supper and whispered grief, came down around her without a sound, because the moment the county learned what was in those letters, the man she had painted as the cold heir would become the lord who had set right his father's one great shame and her own son's claim, which had rested entirely on the new Earl being unworthy, would have nothing left to stand on. She understood it all in an instant. Prudence saw the understanding cross her face. The older woman did not rage. She had too much breeding to rage. She drew herself up, and she said in a voice from which all the music had gone that she would write to her friends to expect her, and that she found the country did not agree with her after all. It was the nearest thing to surrender such a woman could make, and the Earl, to his credit, did not press her past it. He had what he needed. He did not require her ruin, only her removal. She was gone within 2 days. She and her soft son and her trunks and her footman, and the house let out a breath it had been holding since the funeral. Prudence did not stay to feel the house breathe. For all that had passed in the library, she was still a dismissed servant without a character. And a held hand in a grey dawn was not a place in the world, and she knew too well what the county would make of an Earl who kept the maid he had been seen holding hands with. She would not be that to him, the thing his aunt had named, the help that found a use for itself. So, on the 3rd morning, she put on her bonnet again and took up her box again and went down to the kitchen door, meaning to walk to the market town and find what honest work a careful woman might find. The frost was on the park. The bare trees stood black against a sky, the color of pearl. Well, she had got as far as the end of the long avenue, where the lime trees met overhead, and the gravel gave way to the road. When she heard a horse behind her, and she did not stop, because she could not bear to. And then his voice came, and it was not level any longer. Prudence. He had never said her given name. She had not known. He knew it. She stopped on the cold road with her box in her two hands and turned, and the Earl of Brookhaven swung down from the horse before it had fully halted and came to her across the frozen gravel, and he was bareheaded in the cold, and his breath stood white on the air. "You were going to leave," he said, without a word. "It is not my place to stay," she said. "People will say things. I know precisely what people will say." He stood close now, closer than the careful distance he had kept for weeks, and he did not step back. "I have spent 11 years being what people say. I buried my father believing a lie because it was the story the world found easiest. I will not lose the one person who told me the truth, because I am afraid of what a county dinner thinks." He took the box gently out of her hands and set it on the ground at the side of the road. Then he straightened, and the hard stillness of him had cracked clean across, and what was underneath was not cold at all. "Stay," he said, "not as a servant, not as anything they will whisper about. Stay as the woman I mean to marry, before the whole county, in the church where my father is buried, so that there is no word any of them can say that I have not said first." And louder, the wind moved in the bare lime trees. Somewhere off across the white park, a rook called once and went quiet. Prudence stood on the road that led away from Brookhaven and looked up into the face of the man who had asked her, and she found she could not pretend even now, even with everything in her wanting to, that she had not loved him since the morning he caught her in an untruth and almost smiled. "You should not," she said. "I have nothing. I am the daughter of a country attorney. I have no fortune, no name the county would know, nothing at all that such a marriage is supposed to bring." "You have the only thing I have wanted since I came home to this house," he said, "and you have had it since the night you chose not to lie to a dead man for the comfort of the living." He took her hand again there in the cold, and this time he did not let it go. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I rescue you. You have rescued yourself and me, and a drowned man's family besides. Marry me because I do not wish to be honest alone for the rest of my life." She had meant to refuse him for his own sake. She found, when she opened her mouth, that the refusal was not in her. So she gave him the truth instead, as she had given him every truth since the night of the letters, and the truth was a single word, and she said it. They were married 6 weeks later, in the small gray church, at the edge of the Brookhaven lands, with the river running high and brown beyond the churchyard wall, and the first green showing in the water meadows. The county came, because the county always came, and a good number of them had arrived, prepared to be scandalized, and went home having been, instead, witnesses to a thing they could not quite explain, which was the sight of an earl who looked at a former servant as though she had hung the morning. The widow of Ferncross was there, in a new black gown bought with the first of her restored arrears, her soldier's son home and beside her, and she wept all through the service, and afterward she took Prudence's 2 hands in her work-worn ones, and could not speak. Lady Sabine did not come. She sent from a great distance a stiff letter of congratulation that fooled no one, and a piece of plate, and she was not spoken of again at Brookhaven except kindly, which was its own quiet correction, for nothing rebukes a person who has been cruel like being remembered without malice. On the evening of the wedding, when the guests had gone and the house had settled, Prudence went up to the great blue room where the old Earl had died, which her husband had not been able to enter since the funeral, and she found that he had gone there before her. He stood by the bed in the firelight with the rosewood box in his hands, the same box she had carried out from beneath the bed on the night of the rain. The 11 letters lay inside it, untied, the faded green ribbon coiled beside them. He did not look up when she came in. He said that he had thought, all this while, that he would burn them now that they had done their work, that there was no longer any need to keep his father's shame above the ground. "And will you?" she asked. "No," he said. He closed the box gently. They asked for help 11 times, and no one answered. The least a house can do is keep the asking, so that it never forgets again. He set the box on the mantel above the fire where it would stand in the warm light of every evening, and he turned to her, and the last of the carved stillness had gone out of his face for good. They did not burn the letters. They kept them on the mantel of the blue room where the firelight found the worn green ribbon each evening, and where on the first cold night of every winter, after the Earl and his wife would stand a moment together and read aloud the widow's first letter, the drowned man, the broken word, the children at the gate, so that the promise the house had once forgotten would never again be allowed to go quiet in the dark. If the quiet courage of a woman who would not lie for the comfort of the powerful has stayed with you, stay a moment longer in it before you go, and carry it kindly into your own evening. The candle in the blue room was new now, tall and unhurried, and it burned far down into the night while the river ran high beyond the dark window, and no hand reached out of the bed to bid anyone put the truth into the fire.